Ideas shape the world. They give meaning, direction, and possibility. I'm Willie Pietersen, former CEO, Columbia professor, and author of Leadership: The Inside Story, an exploration of the principles that have shaped my leadership journey. Some ideas last for centuries. Others emerge and redefine how we lead. This is Ideas That Matter.
I'd like to welcome Willie Pietersen to another episode of Ideas That Matter. Willie, today we're going to be talking about a fascinating question that is very near and dear to my heart. Why do so many companies fail at implementation? If you take a look at the average lifespan of companies, they've declined from 61 years, being in a high-ranking position, I'll say, in 1958 to 18 years of leadership today. What's the cause of that alarming statistic?
We can't expect to win unless we understand why we lose. We're losing at this game right now, the game of long-term survival. The most important responsibility of senior management is to maintain the continuity of the organization. That's most important, sustaining the organization over the long term, and we're failing at that at a greater and greater rate. So there are a number of things that come to attention, I think, here. The first of them is the sin of inside-out thinking. It's constantly framing our issues in terms of what we want to do or what we think must be done, as opposed to saying we need to respond to the needs, requirements of the external environment. We have a dictator that determines what needs to be done internally, and that dictator resides outside the boundaries of our organization. Success occurs outside. Inside is where we muster resources to create the external impact, and that's where we count the money. So we have countless examples of inside-out thinking, and ultimately that leads to defeat. Just pleasing ourselves is not a winning game.
Can you give us some examples of other causes of implementation failure?
Yes, I would say that's one of them. And the other I've noticed, and a couple more of them that I'll mention here. Waiting too long. You know, a favorite question of mine at the beginning of a strategic engagement is to look at prior results for the organization. Let's say the year prior was a good year financially. And then my question is, to think about that, I say to these executives, what percentage of the success that you've created last year came from decisions you took last year? And what percentage came from decisions taken in prior years by your predecessors? You know, the average I'm getting, it depends on the high-tech industry, it's a more rapid thing. They're saying, well, 50, 60% of the results from last year occurred from decisions taken last year. But the gross average, and I'm just anecdotally, gross average is about 1/3. 1/3 of the success that we created last year was done by decisions we took last year. The other 2/3 from prior decisions. Now we step back and say, let's interpret that. You know, as Nietzsche liked to say, there are no facts, there are only interpretations. What does this mean? Now I begin to get provocative. And so you know what you're actually doing, and it feels really good, doesn't it? You're surfing on momentum. Mm-hmm. And that feels good, and it gives you the wrong message. And the message you're giving yourself is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And the message you should be giving yourself is, if we don't fix it, it will break. So surfing on momentum, it's very, very seductive. People do it all the time. Another one that comes to mind is the wrong framing of the challenge. I think here of General Motors. It's a very sad decline that we witnessed of General Motors from its height, more than 50% of the auto market, down to 18%, around that number currently, and it went insolvent. And you say, well, they hired very intelligent people at General Motors. They didn't say, let's go and recruit the dumbest people we can find. It's never a question of intellectual horsepower. It's a question of how you think. Now, they framed the challenge. The Japanese automakers, Honda, Toyota, came into the US market with very reliable cars with very competitive pricing. General Motors, over time, with its very large market share, it kind of depended on this thing of, renewing the product regularly, etc., as the way of maintaining their volume. Planned obsolescence, I think they called it. Trouble with planned obsolescence is if you plan too deliberately to make things obsolescent, you're going to build some poor quality cars. And they succeeded at that. Now, so in comes Toyota and Honda with these high quality, very reliable, going like little sewing engines, on and on and on, good fuel consumption, and at very reasonable prices. GM's response to this was deeply concerning. They said, we have a cost problem. That's the source of our problems. We gave away too much money to the unions before these Japanese came in, and now we have these very high costs. We can't compete effectively against Honda and Toyota. So the call to action is reduce costs. Reduce costs, and then the volume declined further. They said if it declined further, we're going to reduce the costs even further to match the lower volume, and they kept doing that in a race to the bottom. That wasn't their problem. Their problem was a customer value problem, not a cost problem. Customers were rejecting their products because the other products were offering superior value. Now, that's not very complicated. And they just didn't come up with that wake-up call. It was actually the financial engineers in the US government who rescued General Motors from insolvency and said, you've got to concentrate on your customers, and pleasing customers is the only way to profitability. You do that efficiently, you'll get very rich. You do that badly, you'll go broke again. Total misframing. The other one that I'd mention is trying to do too many things. Now, I come back here to the definition, which I'm going to repeat, of what strategy is. That came to us from Carl von Clausewitz. The talent of the strategist is to define the decisive point and then to concentrate everything on it. Withdrawing from secondary fronts and ignoring lesser objectives. Much of that definition, the second half of the definition, is about subtraction. And there's this little mantra I have. If you want to be successful, subtract first, then multiply. Steve Jobs, I've mentioned before in prior interviews, used to take his top 100 executives on a retreat every year. And he posed a challenge to them. He said, at the end of this retreat, I want you to tell me what the 10 most important things are that we need to work on in the future for Apple to flourish. So on the final day, they said collectively, here's our 10. He wrote them on a whiteboard, and he systematically crossed out 7. And he said, we're going to focus on these 3. And people would put up their hands and say, but this one and that one's also important. Let's put that on the back burner. And he would say, there's no back burner. There are only these three things. And everybody here, all the energy, all the creative energy in this room and your people was concentrated on these 3 things. And he was a fairly aggressive character. And he said, if you don't want to work on these 3, you're free to leave. Now, this intense focus on the few things that matter most is a very important thing. Here, I think I can point to General Electric's demise, not demise, but its collapse, its business model collapse as a conglomerate. It developed over time a very sprawling business to consumer appliances, business to business, all of the industrial products, business to government. They serve the government as well. And banking. They become one of the largest banks in the world with GE capital. And with this complexity, they began to lose their way. They couldn't even really accurately monitor their own progress, because whenever there was a gap in performance in one of the operating units, they were able to draw money from the balance sheet of GE capital and fill the gap. So they began to lose the plot. They lost $500 billion in market value. And I believe the market was asking a question that GE failed to answer. And that question was, is GE more valuable than the sum of its parts? Well, the answer was no. And gradually they began to sell off pieces. Too little, too late. And so ultimately now they've aggressively sold everything except aerospace. It's now a one-product company. It subtracted its way to success, ultimately, to survival. And that for me is a very stunning contrast between Steve Jobs and saying, we'll concentrate on these three and the others are off the table, and GE saying, well, we'll do everything. I mean, the philosophy of Jack Welch was that if you've got good leadership, good leaders can do anything. Not true. If you try and do too much, you'll fail. Now, I'd like to offer a metaphor, finally. It comes from nature. I live in New York City in an apartment on the 33rd floor. And we're very lucky. Our apartment overlooks Central Park. And on a clear day, I could look across Central Park and I could see New Jersey. I like to tease some of my colleagues who live there to say, on a clear day, I can see New Jersey. And that's my punishment. That's just a joke that they don't take very well. But, back to being serious, it's lovely. Now, I have an office. My office has a balcony. It overlooks Central Park. It's lovely. I'm very fortunate. My wife is a writer. She has an office with a balcony, also overlooking Central Park. As a writer, my wife, Laura, is a creative soul. That's sometimes scary. We were having lunch one day, and she said, I have an idea. And now, of course, I'm on guard. And I said, what's your idea? She said, let's beautify our balconies. And I said, what do you mean? We would put fairy lights around the railings. And she said, no. Let's plant geraniums around the railings, and we'll have a lovely garden right in front of us. And we look beyond it, Central Park, and the reservoir, and the Garden State, New Jersey, right? And so we got the garden center to come and plant the geraniums. It made a huge difference. It was lovely to look at. I had a client who was head of an insurance company, and name was Tom. And he regularly used to come to New York. We used to come sit down and troubleshoot things, and often go and stand on my balcony and, think about the greater meaning of life, right? And on this occasion, since the last visit, we planted the geraniums. So I said, Tom, let's go out on the balcony. It was a nice day. Went on the balcony, and Tom looked across and pointed at Laura's geraniums and said, gee, Willie, look at those lovely geraniums. And I looked across, and actually her geraniums were fuller and nicer than mine. I said, yes, Tom, those are lovely, and these are mine here. And Tom said, yes, it's a pity they look so sickly, isn't it? So I said, well, Tom, let's go inside. We chatted. At lunch then, subsequently, I said to Laura, Tom had come again. He's a very valued client, he's a good friend. And he insulted my geraniums. And he praised yours. And yours are better. So clearly you've been cheating, because we water them on the same day. They face the same direction. And yours are better than mine. What is it? Cow manure? Miracle Grow? She said, no. I said, well, what is it then? Just pure luck. She said, no, follow me. She grabbed a garbage bag and a pair of scissors. She came and brutally assaulted my geraniums, hacking away. I thought she'd gone nuts. I said, stop, you're ruining my garden. She said, no, I'm not. I'm creating it. Just wait 1 week. 1 week later, I had these beautiful geraniums. I wanted to call up Tom, who was in Chicago. Hey, Tom, come back here and look at my geraniums. But, I then, Laura's creative. I tend to be the deeply analytical. And on subsequent lunch, and this is really, she'd tell the same story. I said to her, I've discovered a universal truth from this experience we've had with the geraniums. She said, well, here you go again, but what's your universal truth? I said, well, here it is. We've had a proof point here. Whenever you remove the underperforming parts of any living system, that system will use its remaining resources to deliver better results, and that system will flourish, whether it's your garden or your business. And I constantly tell that story to people who don't believe the subtraction issue, is I can prove it through nature. Yeah. I ask people who grows roses, who prunes roses, etc. Anyway, that for me is kind of an illustration that I like to offer of the power of subtraction.
So I think, though, that also when you subtract and simplify things, it's so much easier for people to understand.
Yeah.
It's simple. Now they can get their emotions involved.
Yes.
Now they can get the emotional commitment to adopt the change. How important is that, and how do they do that in business?
I'm so glad you raised that, because we tend to think in operational terms. The issue really is that all work happens through people. No matter what the work is, it happens through people. And great work happens through inspired people. So now when we want our strategy in a very competitive, demanding environment, our strategy to be a winning strategy, and get our people committed to doing that, how do we go about that as leaders? I think what the first order of business is for us to tune in to what's going on in the minds of our employees. Look at the world through their eyes to begin with. If you want to activate passion and commitment, first order of business, seek to understand before being understood, right, as the ancient wisdom. Now, there are always three questions happening in the minds of employees. And at times of change, these questions are burning in their minds. We have to answer these questions. Question one, they're asking themselves, what are we trying to achieve? And why should I care? You've got to give people a reason to care. Second question, where does my department fit in? And what's expected of me? It's got to land on my desk ultimately. I want to do something that makes a bigger difference. And the third question is, how will we measure success? And what's in it for me? Don't just have a town hall meeting every 3 months and tell us how well we're doing. Make it transparent, so I can see through the measures that we do every month what's working, what's not working, and how I respond. Those are the three questions. Now, we need to communicate in a way that answers those three questions. And here Bernard Shaw, the playwright, made a rather amusing comment when he talked about communication. And he said, the problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred. Now, I think that comes from two sources. The first is not tuning into those three questions and completely missing your audience, saying what you want to say and not what they need to hear. And the second problem, that I think what Bernard Shaw was getting at, communication is not an event. It's a campaign. It comes from repetition over and over in different settings, in different kinds of meetings, and different reminders. It's a campaign. It goes on and on. It's not a single town hall meeting and a PowerPoint slideshow, and then say, don't take the hill now. It doesn't work like that. So what I think the conclusion is here is that when we think about strategy implementation and galvanizing the emotions and commitments of human beings, the ultimate deliverable of a strategy is not just a document. It's a leadership story. Now, you need to have a document as a point of reference. It needs to be a very simple document, never longer than 10 pages. As Blaise Pascal once said, French mathematician and philosopher, wrote to somebody and said, I'm very sorry to write you this long letter, but I didn't have time to write you a short one. Strategy documents are short letters, not long ones. So that's the first requirement. But you can't wave around a document and say, look at this document and read it, please, and then follow it. People don't follow documents. They follow leaders and they follow ideas. So the truth of the matter is that we need to rediscover the oral tradition of storytelling to engage the emotions of our employees. And a lot of what I do on my strategy workshops is to dwell on that aspect of it at the end of it and get people rehearsing and talking through the stories that help clarify the strategy. Then I get questions. So I'm not an extrovert, I'm an introvert. That's irrelevant. It's about authenticity. It's about telling a story that you totally believe in. It's about telling a story that engages others. It's nothing to do with extrovert or introvert. You don't have to wave your arms around to tell a good story.
So the 10-page strategy document might tell you the details, but the story is what's really important because that gets the emotion, the personal engagement, the ability to adopt the changes. What, in your mind, are the features of a great story?
Yeah, it's good to think about that before we start assembling our story. I think the first task of a good story is simplification. It gets you to the essence of what needs to be done. And then you use stories and metaphors and so on to reinforce that. Metaphors are magical because they're never totally complete. That leaves the listener to complete the story, the metaphor, in their own minds, and they become co-creators of the idea. So using great metaphors is a super way of doing it. Then you have to engage people not just intellectually, but also emotionally. You know, we go to the theater to listen to a story. Why do we do that? It's because it raises an issue. And at an intermission, we're all muttering and saying, I wonder what's going to happen. And then it resolves the issue. And the good story is always the same. It raises an issue that's important to people. It's not trivial, so I'm not interested in that issue. It raises an issue of interest to people, and it offers a resolution. And it's a call to action in that kind of way. It's a very, very important thing. I think of various stories that illustrate this point. And one of them comes from African tribal wisdom that I'm very interested in. And one of the things about the survival of a tribe is unity. And that unity builds strength. You need to inculcate that into young people. And there's this little story, and again, whether it's true or not, I don't know, but it's a compelling story, of the elders wanting to teach the young folk about the importance of unity, helpfulness, making a contribution to the overarching goals and success of the tribe. Now, one way is for an elder to stand there and ask a little 10-year-old boy to come across and say, I want to tell you something really, really important. So pay attention. Unity builds strength. Okay, little boy? Can you imagine that little kid running off in great excitement, jumping up and down, saying to his friends, I've discovered something that's truly exciting? No. Here's the method the elder used. They were taught, even at a young age, to go and collect dry wood at dusk. to cook the meals, to keep the huts warm at night. They were taught how to identify dry wood. It's the wood that lies on the ground, or if you look in the tree and there are no leaves on a branch, bend it, and if you hear it cracking, that's dry wood. It'll burn and come back with a haul of dry wood. And these kids would come back and be very proud of their accomplishment. Look, all these sticks I've gathered. And so the story goes that the moment came where the elder wanted to teach this young 10-year-old about unity builds strength. So when the kid came galloping in with a haul of sticks, the elder said, "That's very good." And the kid said, "Yes, I'm only 10. And the elder said, "Okay, good." He said, "Well, put the sticks on the ground." The kid put the sticks down. He said, "Pick up one." He picked up one, break it. Bam. "Well done." "Yes, and I'm only 10. Now pick up 3. Kid picks up 3 full of confidence. "Break them." "Sorry, I can't. I'm only 10. You break them." And the elder takes them and said, "I can't break them either. You see, sticks in a bundle are unbreakable." Now, I love that story because just ask yourself for a minute, which version is going to live in the mind of that young kid and inform his behavior for a lifetime? "Come here, little boy, sticks in a bundle are unbreakable." So a unity builds strength, or having this little exercise where the kid participates in something and learns a great lesson. I told this story to the Girl Scouts of America, and now they've got a conference center just outside of New York, and they've got sticks in a bundle tied with a little bow in all of their little conference rooms in this conference center to remind everybody there that it's unification that matters most in success. So that's a kind of example. Now, the final point, I think, of a good story is that it's totally authentic, that you embody the story. You've not borrowed it from somebody else, but it's not in accordance with your own behaviors and beliefs. There's no gap there. And there's another story to illustrate that point that comes from ancient Rome. And it goes to the definition of the word sincere. Now, it so happened that the elites in Rome, the patricians, used to have sculptures made, put those on the front of their villa. Sculptures of the paterfamilias, the head of the family. And passers-by would say, "Very important family. Look at that statue they've got there, the bust, the sculpture." And then there were the lower classes, right? Plebeians. Some of them were pretenders and said, "Well, I want to have a sculpture in my front of my villa too, to show that I'm important." But they couldn't afford to go to the best sculptors and pay the money for this excellent work. So they went to these sculptors that did very inexpensive work, and the work had a number of defects. But they were very clever. They covered their defects with colorless wax. And so now the plebeians would put the sculpture in the front of the villa, but when the wind and the sun and the rain beat down, all the wax evaporated. The superior sculptors had a sign above their door. The sign said, "Sine cera," in Latin, without wax. That's what sincere means. You show up without wax. So when you're tested by the sun and the rain and the wind, you're still authentic. No wax. Hi, I'm Willie Pietersen. Leadership is not about wielding power. It's about authenticity and inspiring others to achieve a shared purpose. Excelling as a leader is a continuous journey of pursuing ideas that matter as the environment shifts and new challenges emerge. Thank you for watching. Please share your ideas by leaving your comments below. We learn best when we learn together. And if you've enjoyed this discussion, I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Thank you again.